So the sort of people who live paycheck to paycheck are low-income earners, the sort of people that would benefit from more dollars in their pocket every week to pay for the kids' excursions, to pay for the groceries, to put fuel in the car. They're not getting it that way. It's only those on high incomes who probably don't live paycheck to paycheck who are getting it in that form.
One for mum, one for dad, one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be in Australia.
Dead, buried, cremated.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day, and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute.
First reading a bill for an act to appropriate money out of the consolidated revenue.
We're still in post-budget fever here at the Institute, or economist Christmas, as our senior economist Matt Grudnoff describes it. Matt and Dave Richardson, our senior research fellow, join me today for a post-budget wash-up. It's Scott Morrison's last budget before the next federal election. And surprise, surprise, the big theme this year is tax cuts. We'll unpick who the real winners and losers of this year's federal budget really are, but first...
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I move that this bill now be read a second time. What have you achieved? What are you going to do now?
It was definitely an election budget. It was a big splash out. What was most interesting is usually at election budgets you have, some tax cuts or some sort of stuff on the revenue side. But you also have stuff on the spending side. But in this budget, there was basically nothing very much on the spending side at all. In fact, the policy changes were worth about $15 billion. And the tax cut by itself was worth about $13.5 billion. So almost all of the policy change was just the one tax cut.
In this budget, we are providing tax relief to encourage and reward working Australians and to reduce the cost pressures on households.
Overall impression, big surge in revenue, and they've used that to produce a flat personal income tax system.
So quite radical, really.
Yep, it's one of those things that takes us further away from a progressive tax system and more towards redistributing income in favour of the rich.
As Dave said, they're talking about flattening the tax rate. And what I found quite fascinating after the budget in the government cell is that they're denying that it's going to ruin the progressive nature of the income tax rates, but at the same time they're gloating that 94% of people will be on the same rate of tax. Now, if 94% of the population, of the tax-paying population, is on the same rate, then that's a flat tax.
Yeah.
Clearly the vast majority of people are all on the same rate of tax. That's a flat tax. So they seem to have two messages. One, it's still a progressive tax, and two, it's not a progressive tax.
Morrison had warned us, or if we were listening, we should have noticed, when he started talking about how much the rich pay as a share of total tax collections in Australia, up around 17%, I think it was his figure. Mm. But these are the people that earn the bulk of the income.
Yeah.
Do we really expect them to pay the same proportion as the age pensioners?
And is it tax reform?
Well, no, it's not. The government has kind of warped the idea of tax reform. When they say tax reform, they mean lower taxes. But tax reform, if you talk to an economist, tax reform is about working out how much you need to raise, and that's a democratic question. That is, people vote or tell their politicians what sort of services they want. And then tax reform is about raising that money in the most efficient way while still being fair. So tax reform might involve increasing taxes, tax reform might involve decreasing taxes, or tax reform might be keeping the tax level at the same level. But tax reform doesn't always equal lowering taxes, which is what this government believes.
Mm. And the other thing too is it's got this funny element in it. For low middle income earners, we're going to have this new version of the low income tax offset, which gives you an extra dose in your tax refund, but does nothing for your take-home pay during the rest of the year. And I don't think people have understood this yet, that you're not going to get anything week to week. Somebody said you'd be able to change your tyres at the end of the year.
So it's that far away for people. They're not going to see any of the benefits of the tax cut until quite some time away.
That's right. And what's fascinating about that is and most of this tax cut is going to go to the top end. But when they're handing it out to the top end, it comes in the form of a tax cut every time you get paid. So if you get paid fortnightly, you get more in your pay packet every fortnight. Except, of course, when we hand it out to those on low incomes, then we hand it out as a refund after you put your tax return in.
Yeah.
So the sort of people who live paycheck to paycheck are low income earners, the sort of people that would benefit from more dollars in their pocket every week to pay for the kids' excursions, to pay for the groceries, to put fuel in the car. They're not getting it that way. It's only those on high incomes who probably don't live paycheck to paycheck who are getting it in that form.
Tonight I announce a 7-year personal tax plan to make personal income tax lower, fairer and simpler.
But is flattening the tax system really simplifying it, or just making it more unfair? What it does do is simply hide the fact that most of the benefit of this tax cut will go to the already wealthy. Australian Institute research shows that 62% of the benefit of this tax cut goes to the top 20% of taxpayers, while the bottom 30% of taxpayers get just 7% of the benefit.
Well, what we found is that because these tax cuts are mainly for the top end, that for every dollar of tax cut going to women, men get $2 worth of tax cut. They get twice the tax cut that women are getting. And that's in large part because men earn more than women, and this tax cut is overwhelmingly going to the top end. 62% of this tax cut is going to the top 20%, 40% to the top 10% of income earners. We have gender inequality already, and this tax cut is going to further entrench that by giving more tax refund to men and less of a tax cut to women.
And so down the track, if revenue doesn't perform as well as expected and we end up getting spending cuts, I think you've done research in the past too that shows that disproportionately affects women as well when we cut services down the track.
Yeah, the government likes to slash services, but women rely on those services more than men. So if we look at the 2014 horror budget, if all of those cuts had passed, then women would have borne 55% of the cost of those cuts, whereas men would have only borne 45% of the cost. And the problem is when you hand out $140 billion worth of tax cuts over 10 years, particularly at a time when the budget's ticked up and revenues have increased, well, the next time that revenues go down, the government will be calling for more cuts. So in the good times, we hand out high-income tax cuts to men, and in the bad terms, we cut services to women. And again, that further entrenches gender inequality.
I was going to ask Matt if he could elaborate on the implications for the demographic that's most affected by the incentive effects of the tax welfare system, the secondary income earner in most families.
What's interesting is often these tax cuts are justified by the government by saying that, well, if we cut people's taxes, it encourages them to work harder, it encourages them to earn more, so GDP will grow, incomes will grow, we'll all be better off. The problem is the evidence shows that the people who are more likely to work longer hours and work more are actually second income earners, usually women returning after having kids to the workforce. The problem is when we've given out tax cuts, traditionally we've given it to the top end. And they're the people who are least likely to change how hard they work based on a tax cut. So if you're on $200,000 a year, you're salaried, it doesn't matter whether you work 70 hours a week or 40 hours a week, you're going to earn the same amount, you're on very good money, and you're unlikely to decide to quit or not quit your job based on a tax cut.
Pick up an extra shift on the weekend.
Exactly right. And so these are the ones that are least likely to be impacted, but they're the ones that we throw most of the value of these tax cuts at. These are the ones we give the biggest tax cut to.
The company tax cuts are still baked into this budget. Yep. Are they still a bad idea, Dave?
How long have we got?
As a matter of fact, we just devoted an entire special episode of Pocket Money outlining why the company tax cuts are a bad idea. To hear about why a $16 billion tax cut each year to companies is not going to trickle down and benefit most Australians, either in the form of more jobs or increased GDP, you can listen to the Pocket Money episode we just recorded before this budget. So, if you add up the cost of the company tax cuts with the cost of the newly announced personal income tax cuts, exactly how much money will be missing from the government's coffers?
Well, that's an interesting question, and it's one that the government won't reveal. But the best estimates is that the income tax cuts will be worth about $25 billion, the order of, when they're fully implemented. But again, the government's not revealing those numbers, so that's a guess. The company tax cuts are $16 billion a year. So we're looking at close to $40 billion a year of tax cuts once it's fully implemented.
And these are cuts that don't come in fully implemented for another 7 years in the case of the personal, and a few years beyond that in the case of the company tax. And what do we really know about what the economy is going to look like in the year 2024?
But I suppose what we'll know for sure is if we have a Conservative government at that point, and the economy does turn down, it won't be a revenue problem, it'll be a spending problem, and that they will go to town again on education, health, government services, and they won't acknowledge at all that $40 billion worth of tax cuts each year had anything to do with the deteriorating budget position.
We here in Australia don't have a dole bludger problem. What we have is a society that's being unnecessarily cruel.
The unemployment payment has not been increased in real terms in over 24 years. It's now, the base rate is just $38 a day. It needs to be increased by $75 per week.
Could you live on $40 a day?
I could live on $40 a day.
Ahead of the budget, there were growing calls to increase unemployment benefits, the New Start allowance. New Start has not increased outside inflation since 1994. It's well below the poverty line. And joining the chorus to see the payment lifted included some unlikely supporters in the Business Council of Australia and the former Prime Minister who introduced Work for the Dole.
Mr Howard, do you agree New Start should increase?
Yeah, I actually think there is an argument about that, yeah, I do.
And what's the argument?
Well, I think it is. I was in favour of freezing it when it happened. But I think the freeze is probably too long.
What was there in the budget on New Start?
Absolutely nothing. This is a real serious issue. We've been plotting the fortunes of an unemployed family of four since 1975, and they've gone from a peak of 10% above the Henderson poverty line in 1992 to now about 20% below. So that particular family is almost $200 a week below that poverty line.
Yeah.
This is getting real serious. It gets worse and worse every year, and so far no government is addressing it. The single adult is $183 a week behind the eight ball. These are real serious issues, and for a country like Australia, one of the richest countries in the world, this is just an appalling indictment on decision making.
Yeah, the fact that we have had this unexpected revenue windfall and we're not doing anything to address that really talks to the government's priorities.
And can I say, when John Howard thinks the unemployment benefits are too low, damn it, the unemployment benefits are too low.
And every dollar and every cent committed to delivering the National Disability Insurance Scheme remains in place and always will.
And Dave, you looked into the NDIS in this budget. What's in there on that front?
Yeah, the NDIS is really interesting because we've had all sorts of concerns expressed before the budget about whether or not funding was sustainable. You may remember that last budget, Morrison said that he would increase the Medicare levy by 0.5% in order to fund the gap in NDIS funding. He then abolished that, saying we don't need it anymore, and he's sort of right because of the surge in revenue. But when you look at the mechanics of how the NDIS is set up, it's really peculiar, with half the funding coming from the states, but all the spending coming from the Commonwealth. It all goes through a statutory authority, so the government has no direct control over a statutory authority. They're the responsible for spending the money, but the money is cash limited by appropriation. Now, what that can mean is that programs that run short have to try and ration the money available to them among the claimants. And there's some intriguing wording in the budget papers. On the one hand, Morrison has publicly said, well, there's no funding problem and, we guarantee funding of the NDIS. But in the fine print in the budget papers, you read that the Commonwealth says it guarantees its share of the NDIS.
Yep.
So does this mean that unlike, say, if you present at the emergency room of a hospital, even if the hospital's budget has ended or finished, you'll still get treated? The government will just throw more money in. You're saying that the NDIS, if the budget has hit the cap or is getting close to the cap, they can turn you away.
And the hospitals do a similar thing in a way, the way they ration, keep people out in the waiting rooms longer and that sort of thing. But the contrast is more dramatic with, say, the age pension.
Mm-hmm.
Under our legislation, if you meet the eligibility criteria and you front up, the government has to pay you the age pension because it's provided for in its own legislation, and it doesn't have to depend on annual appropriations. This gets you into
quite technical stuff,
Yeah. But the point is that as it stands now, things like Medicare, the age pension, and even unemployment payments, they're all guaranteed by legislation, whereas the NDIS is cash limited by appropriation.
Okay, I get that now. But the budget wasn't all bad. Tucked away in the budget papers is something that the Australia Institute has been recommending for a long time now. The pension loan scheme is a plan we suggested to the government to help retirees who are asset rich but income poor.
At the moment, there's a small scheme whereby people outside of the pension system, but in retirement, are able to borrow to supplement their income from the government and repay that out of their estate. The government plans to extend that to all pensioners so that you'll be able to top up your income with a sort of a negative loan instalment from the government that will be then recovered out of your estate. It can mean that your weekly resources are up to twice what the pension delivers.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good idea, and it's one that the Australia Institute's been advocating since about 2014. And the reason it's a good idea is because a lot of pensioners complain, rightly, that they're asset rich but income poor.
Cash poor.
Yep, and so if you do own your own home, and most pensioners do, not all, and if you don't own your own home, then this scheme isn't going to help a pensioner. But if you do own your own home, you'll be able to increase your income effectively by drawing out of the equity of your home. So you'll be able to support your day-to-day spending and by basically drawing out of your home loan.
And previously this has only been available to people who aren't on the age pension, but now we're going to make it available to people who are on the age pension as well.
That's exactly right. If you were way too wealthy to even be able to access a pension, then previously you could access this. Now it will include people who do get a pension. So it's a good change from the government. The government should be congratulated for doing it.
And so it'll benefit pensioners. It's an existing scheme. A lot of people just don't know about it. And really the only people it's going to impact on is perhaps their children getting a slightly smaller inheritance. Is that right?
That's exactly right. If the government really wanted to make this work, then they should embark on an advertising campaign to let pensioners know that this thing exists, because I think the vast majority of them don't know. And so I think that, if there was ever a good reason to have some government advertising about a particular program, then this would be the one.
Yeah.
My fellow Australians, as I listened to the government's fifth budget on Tuesday night, I knew immediately we can do better than this. The people of Australia deserve better than this, and a Labor government will deliver better than this.
And what Labor have effectively said is that they're going to double, or approximately double, what the Liberal and National parties are offering as part of that tax cut. Now, they haven't got on board with the later parts of the tax cut, which mainly go to high income earners, but they also haven't said that they're definitely going to reject them. So they're sort of in a grey area about whether or not they're going to support those. But what they announced in the budget reply speech was that those more targeted to middle and low income earners, they were going to expand those and hand out more money to people.
Another important distinction is that Labor has promised to improve spending, particularly on education and health. This is terribly important. You remember that from the first Abbott hockey budget, there were cuts in those areas. Sneakily, they said they were going to honour the forward estimates, but cut the implied increases in those areas after that. They were going to take something like $100 billion out.
So they hid the cuts
That's right.
well
That's
beyond
right.
what the budget papers kind of spell out.
Yeah, but they're coming in now, or in the present forward estimates. So in real terms, they're cutting education and health, and Labor has promised to restore that. I haven't looked at the details to work out if it's going to be a full restoration, and perhaps it's too hard to tell anyway. But this is something to keep an eye on, because it's those sorts of areas that really determine our future prosperity. Those and infrastructure. If we get those things right, Australians will be much better off compared with, the ephemeral tax cuts that we get from year to year.
And so if you're judging them both as pre-election budgets, who do you think comes out on top? Who delivers more for regular people?
Well, I think the Labor Party obviously delivers a larger tax cut to the majority of people. They actually deliver less over the 7 years if they don't support the later tax cuts, just because so many dollars are going to flow to high income earners. But that's an increasingly smaller number of people. Just looking at it not so much economically but politically, I think that the Labor Party are in a better position at the moment simply because over the last sort of 3 or 4 years they've been rolling out revenue measures and putting them in place. Things like cracking down on negative gearing and the capital gains tax discount, refundability of dividend franking credits, these sort of things. They've put those policies in place. Now, normally it happens the other way around. Normally political parties are very happy to announce the spending, the good part of it, or the tax cuts, because that's what people want, but they're very reluctant to talk about how they're going to raise the extra revenue. Because the Labor Party have done it in reverse, they now have a larger war chest, if you like, or a larger chunk of money in which they can spend on things like infrastructure or health or education or other income tax cuts, because they've done the hard yards early. Whereas I think the government's in a slightly worse position because they are unwilling to raise extra revenue. They're going to, I think, have difficulty in the coming election campaign, particularly if handing out dollars is what wins elections. Then I think Labor's in a better position.
So to be clear, our plan for a stronger economy is tax relief to encourage and reward working Australians, backing business to invest and create more jobs, guaranteeing the essential services Australians rely on, keeping Australians safe, and ensuring the government continues to live within its means.
So overall, thinking back just to the government's budget, what they delivered, who are the winners, Dave? Who comes out on top?
Compared with the baseline, all taxpayers get something. Those outside the tax system, the really poor, they're slipping behind in relative terms all the time. And look, the people that wanted certainty in especially the NDIS, but also, health, education, things like that, they didn't get anything.
So most taxpayers, what about you, Matt? Who are the winners and losers out of the budget?
Well, in the short term, over the next 4 years, it's middle and low income taxpayers, which is not all low income earners. I mean, there are a lot of low income earners who don't pay tax and aren't part of the tax system. So we're talking about middle and low income taxpayers. But over the few years after that, it's by far high income earners. Just to put that in context, the government has said that their tax cut will cost $140 billion over 10 years. Over the first 4 years, when they're just handing out to middle and low income earners, that'll only cost about $13.5 billion. So less than 10% of the cost of the tax cut happens to low income earners, which means that the vast majority of the money being handed out is going to go to high income earners, and they're going to be looking at some really large tax cuts per fortnight, per year, out past 5, 6 and 7 years from now.
I estimated that you don't quite get the milkshake if you're under 37,000, but after 7 years, if you're around 200,000, you get enough to meet the repayments on a brand new Commodore.
Jeez, that's not bad. I'll have to get a better paying job.
Analysis from the Australia Institute that says about 60... Australia Institute.
Oh, they're my favourite.
That's been episode 25 of Follow the Money, recorded on the 16th of May and brought to you by the Australia Institute. You can go to our Facebook page for our Budget Bogglebox video and head to our website at tai.org.au for more budget analysis and to find previous episodes. In particular, don't forget to check out the latest Pocket Money special on why the company tax cuts are a bad idea, and you can also go back to episode 6 for more analysis on tax cuts. Subscribe to Follow the Money on iTunes or wherever you get your favourite podcasts, and please don't forget to rate us so that other people can find us. We're also on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a NNT. You can find Matt Grudnoff at Matt Grudnoff. This episode was produced by Jennifer Macy. Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum composed our title track, and you can find more of his music at pulseandthrum.com. Thanks for listening.